The Adventure of the Altered Will. It was upon a leaden, sodden evening in the latter part of October, in the year of grace 1896, that I returned from an especially wearisome day at my surgery and found Sherlock Holmes in a state I had come through the years to believe a harbinger of significant events. The fire in our grate burned low, throwing elongated shadows upon the walls of our lodging at 221B Baker Street, while outside the rain lashed the window panes with the fitfulness of a wild animal denied shelter. Holmes stood silhouetted against the pale lamp which flickered upon our writing desk. His tall, wraith-like form seemed animated by internal tension. His fingers, always restless, hovered about the strings of his violin, but no music issued forth, only the faint, plaintive echo of its untuned resonance. There was an air of constrained expectancy about him that, I confess, occasioned a sympathetic chill in my own breast. I have learned, none better, that these moments presaged either the descent into dangerous ennui which threatened my friend's equanimity, or the burst of some crisis which would fire his remarkable faculties for days and nights together. Our silence was broken by a violent rapping at the door. Mrs. Hudson's gentle tread, muffled, yet brisk, preceded the arrival of a harried young footman. He dripped upon our rug, his coat soaked through and hat knocked askew, water marking his face and uniform with the seal of his haste. He could scarce bring himself to look Holmes in the eye as he removed from his breast pocket a folded note and handed it tremblingly across. "From Mr. Edmund Ferrier, sir, of Bloomsbury. He begs to meet you on a matter of utmost urgency." The man's pallid complexion and quavering voice bespoke a distress which was, to my medical eye, neither feigned nor exaggerated. Holmes regarded the missive with narrowed gaze, eyeing the bold, precise script as if it constituted the first layer of some concealed cipher. "Ferrier, an old legal warhorse, Watson, and not one given to fantasy," he murmured, almost to himself. "He writes of vague threats and of enmity kindled anew by a revised will. It is the mark of true danger, my dear fellow, when an orderly man is driven to supplication at so late an hour." "Do you suspect blackmail, Holmes?" I ventured. The atmosphere was thick with foreboding, and I could not quell a slight shiver, brought as much by the uncanny scene as by the draught seeping under the door. He gave a brief, enigmatic smile. "Let us reserve our judgment until we possess the full array of facts. Fetch your coat, Watson. We are summoned, it appears, to the theater of misfortune." Without further comment, he donned his Inverness cape and snatched up the famed deerstalker. The next moment, umbrella in hand, we were out and descending the steps into the billow of rain-swept Baker Street, the footman hurrying ahead with that peculiar speed born of anxiety. Our hansom cab rattled east through the arterial veins of the metropolis, the gas lamps reflected by the streaming glass as the city offered up its secrets to the night. When we arrived at the Ferrier residence, a portico Georgian house nestled among the stately avenues of Bloomsbury, we found a scene awash with disorder that stood in stark contrast to the genteel aspirations of its architecture. Gaslights burned low behind paned glass, casting wavering shadows across the entry hall and up the stair. A hush hung over the vestibule, broken only by the anxious susurrus of the domestic staff, and the quieter, more authoritative murmur of police officers as they conferred in corners and shuffled boots along the Turkish runner. We were admitted by Mrs. Grimshaw, who had evidently been roused from her rest. This raw-boned woman, with a countenance both severe and deeply lined, carried her years with such dignity as only long service could confer. "Mr. Holmes," she whispered, her eyes darting from him to me and back again. "He seemed so burdened, sir, these several days past. But tonight, he spoke of making amends this very week." I feared her voice trembled into silence, though her eyes found mine with mute appeal. "Take us to him," Holmes replied quietly. We passed through a dimly lit corridor and were shown into the study, The room was heavy with the odor of spent wax and the faint, sickly traces of laudanum. Edmund Ferrier's body lay slumped over his writing desk, his once imposing figure drawn in upon itself, white side whiskers, immaculate in the style of the old bar, stained yellow by the dying candle. The scene was one of unfinished business, an uncorked sherry decanter and an empty glass at his right hand, scattered sheets, some bearing the sudden, spidery ink of revision, upon his lap. Dr. Frobisher, the local physician, hovered nearby, a sanctimonious, cadaverous presence, with a black bag resting upon a leather footstool. His voice, when he addressed us, bore that peculiar blend of wariness and self-satisfaction I have often observed in his type. Laudanum overdose, no struggle, no sign of external violence. The old man had the bottle ready to hand. The certificate is there. Suicide in consequence of melancholia, it can only be. Holmes shot him a fleeting, icy glance, then moved to the desk, surveying with feline delicacy the arrangement of decanters, glass, and the various papers. He paused beside the empty glass and leaned in, his nostrils flaring as he inspected its rim. "This stain, Watson, observe." He indicated a faint oily smear upon the glass rim, tinted a curious roseate shade. It would pass unnoticed to most, but this is not the mode of the city's ordinary chemists, even in the West End. He slipped the glass into his coat, nodding for me to examine the deceased. I knelt. Ferrier's expression was not one of pain, but the hands told a different tale. Fingers were tightly clenched, and the nails had bitten into the palms, as if in some last struggle against invading sleep. Holmes now bent to the decanter, examined the rug, and cast a meticulous eye over spills and smears. No disturbance in the fibers. The hand which poured this sherry was steady, not shaking with hysteria or dread. "Tell me, who in this household visits in such lipstick?" "Mrs. Grimshaw." The housekeeper drew herself up, confusion mingling with offense. "None, sir. None but the late Mr. Ferrier's callers. And they were all gentlemen, save for a niece of his, whom I've not seen these 2 years or more." Behind us, a young footman, pale and harried, was being questioned by a constable regarding pawnshops and debts. His protestations that he never touched a drop and would never do the master harm only deepened the air of mystery and suspicion. Yet Holmes's attention wandered from the man's cringing manner to some unseen marker in the shadows, and his eyes grew bright. I recognized the first flare of that intellectual excitation which would, in the coming hours, drive him without rest. "This is far from concluded, Watson," he murmured as we took our leave, "and appearances are seldom more deceptive than when cloaked in respectability." Back at 221B Baker Street, dawn was tardy in subjugating the London fog. I sat at our breakfast table, perusing Ferrier's medical reports with an uneasy sense of responsibility for my testimony at the inquest, which was surely to follow. The post-mortem revealed laudanum in an abnormally high concentration, yet mingled with another substance, one which I recognized as a rare but potent sedative. The combined effect would render the victim first insensible, then quietly usher him into the final sleep. Outside, the city's heartbeat could be felt more than heard, a muffled rumble of drays and hansoms, of newsboys and streetwalkers returning home. Mrs. Hudson made her customary entrance, bearing the breakfast tray. This morning, her good-natured countenance was drawn, her eyes watchful. "There's always more comings and goings around these society desks, Mr. Holmes," she observed sagely as she set down our tea. Holmes, already installed at his desk amid a clutter of correspondence, lifted not his gaze but his hand as he scrawled notes addressed to a half-dozen of his informants and to the now venerable Baker Street irregulars. "Tell me, Watson, would melancholy alone drive an old lawyer to such theatrical exit?" he queried, looking up abruptly, his brow arched in challenge. "Unlikely, Holmes, unless driven to it by extraordinary despair," I replied. "Ferrier's reputation was one for cold logic, not passionate histrionics. Before Holmes could respond, there came a flutter at the window. Wiggins, leader of the irregulars, had himself delivered a reply to one of Holmes's queries. Holmes tore it open with unconscious impatience. His lips barely moved as he read. Only one perfumer in all Mayfair imports a lipstick of this particular hue, a Parisian fabrication, both rare and costly. Of the 3 names in the shop's register, only one matches the circles of Miss Ferrier's acquaintance, Vivian Tress. At the sound of the name, I could not suppress a murmur. I had heard it, whispered as gossip at society dinners. A niece of Ferrier's, once celebrated for her prospects and beauty, lately fallen into dubious circles and, if the truth be told, desperate straits. The circle narrows beautifully, Watson, Holmes said, steepling his long fingers. But we must see for ourselves the world this young woman has made her own. That evening, Holmes and I set forth into the maze of Soho, a district whose squalor, veiled beneath a patina of louche glamour, has harbored intrigues enough to fill volumes. Guided by Holmes's sources, we found ourselves in a certain private club, known to the constabulary and the criminal classes alike. A haze of cigar smoke drifted beneath gilded cornices, and the laughter here was low and sibilant, never without the undertone of calculation. The decor spoke of faded opulence, a world built on rents and vices, not on landed estates. Disguised as idle gentlemen of means, we were shown to a booth by a sharp-eyed barman. Within 10 minutes, Holmes, with the tact born of years in similar pursuits, had opened the conversation to the local gossip. Vivian Tress, sir? The speaker was an habitué of uncertain age, his evening attire redolent of French brandy and lost inheritance. Why, she was seen in here last Friday, losing quite handsomely at piquet. Left in a temper, if memory serves. Did you see her after? Holmes asked, voice coaxing as silk. I saw her, yes. She was veiled, dressed as a widow, you know the sort, slipping out a side door as the hour turned late. The black lace did little to hide that hair of hers. Quite unmistakable, I assure you. They said she was headed toward Bedford Square. Holmes's gaze focused. The scent, the disguise, the surreptitious exit, all were marks of concealment, not mourning. Our questioning, continued with delicacy, established that Vivian, robbed of familial standing and estate, was now enmeshed in debts and clandestine affairs. She kept company with men whose own prospects were shadowed, and whose tempers, as the bartender's glance made clear, ran the gamut, from the reckless to the dangerous. Having gleaned what we could, Holmes nodded, and we withdrew. The bitterness of Miss Tress's absence hung in the air, a ghostly perfume amid whiskey and cigar smoke. Outside, the night pressed cold upon us as we made our way homeward. There is a poetic symmetry to her choice of disguise, Watson, Holmes observed absently. To don widow's weeds for an act which would create a widow in name, if not in fact. I was silent, for the gravity of that night's business weighed unpleasantly upon me. And the next day saw our return to Bloomsbury, the household in a state of nervous torpor. There was little eagerness in the way the servants assembled in the morning room under Holmes's direction. Guilt, whether warranted or not, distills itself swiftly into the nerves of those who serve in proximity to sudden death. Holmes called each in turn, beginning with the young footman whose earlier panic had aroused suspicion. I fled, sir, but I never touched a drop, nor did the master harm. I pawned a trinket for debts, nothing more, he stammered, twisting a tattered pawn ticket in sweaty fingers. Holmes eyed the man's boots, caked with dried mud, of a sort too rough for the inner city. Then, in an instant, his face cleared. Fear makes guileless men act guilty, he said quietly, almost as if to himself. He dismissed the trembling youth with a gentle wave. It was Mrs. Grimshaw who, her sense of duty struggling with personal loyalty, produced the next item of note. There was a letter, sir, left on the master's desk that morning, not signed, but the paper finer than he used, the ink trembling, but the words clear. Retract the will or ruin will follow. Holmes examined it, a sheet of cream stock, its masculine script bearing marks of the habitual, but a trace of curve and delicacy beneath its severity. A woman's touch, attempting a man's attire, Holmes mused aloud. See, Watson, the loop of the D and Y, not unlike the earlier notes Ferrier kept, which related to threats from estranged claimants. He laid it aside, eyes distant. We narrow upon mistress, but possibility of a confederate cannot be dismissed. In such webs as these, the strands cross and bind in unexpected places. He spent a further quarter hour walking the rooms, opening and closing windows, making minute examination of door handles and the edge of the writing desk. His eyes noted everything: the pattern of footsteps in dust, the angle of a half-moved rug. Satisfied at last, Holmes signaled for our departure. One piece remains, and it will be the key, Watson, he said, as our cab rattled away. The following day, I stood before the coroner, called as an expert witness in the matter of Edmund Ferrier's death. The courtroom was draped in the shadows of the approaching winter. The windows gray, the air so chill that breath was visible in clouds before one's lip. I gave my testimony with care, conscious not only of my own professional reputation, but of the higher duty that attaches itself to honest witness. Gentlemen, the sedative action is such that before the fatal dose could be self-administered, the deceased would have lost consciousness. There is no evidence to suggest that Mr. Ferrier acted with intent. Murmurs rippled along the bench. Holmes stepped forward then, producing the glass with the faint lipstick stain and a swatch of that rare Parisian cosmetic. This cosmetic, sir, is of foreign origin, imported only to a single perfumer in London. No one in the Ferrier household, nor among his acquaintances, is known to possess it. All except one, Vivian Tress, have alibis for the night in question. The magistrate inclined his head. Dr. Watson, in your expert opinion, is suicide to be excluded? Entirely, I replied. The combination of sedative and laudanum could not have been self-administered. The deceased was rendered insensible by means of adulterated sherry, then, unconscious, received the fatal dose. It was enough. The figure of the melancholy lawyer, surrounded by anxious servants and secrets, was revealed as a red herring. That evening, by a late hour, Holmes arrayed the notes, samples, and statements upon our table at Baker Street. The room glowed with the soft radiance of lamp and hearth, but Holmes's mood was as somber as I had ever seen it. Here is the trick, Watson, he said, standing with back to the fire. Miss Tress alone had the motive. Ruined in reputation, cut out of the will she once expected to possess. She alone possessed the means and, judging by her recent losses at cards, the nerve and desperation. The Parisian lipstick marks her presence more surely than a signature. She was seen departing the club that very night, veiled as a widow, heading for Bedford Square, which is 2 streets from the Ferrier house. The wine was poured, perhaps under pretext of reconciliation, the drugs administered without knowledge or consent. He gestured to the assembled evidence, the perfumer's letter, the pawn ticket, the witness's statements, the threatening note. All but for a confession, the rope is woven. It only remains to see whether she will deny when faced with the undeniable. I nodded, struck by a heaviness which sprang, not from scientific curiosity, but from the unkind ways in which old injuries, left to fester, can bear fatal fruit. Holmes met my gaze. Sometimes the threads are darker than we imagine, Holmes, I said, repeating his own phrase with new understanding. There you have it, the web, plain upon the loom, my dear chap. X. Scotland Yard greeted us with familiar smells of leather, ink, and pipe smoke. Inspector Lestrade, becomingly deferential, yet searching for a fault, listened as Holmes presented the evidence in glacial detail: timeline, rare cosmetic, the threat, the precise machinery of death. At the culmination, I laid before Lestrade my own report, bearing the seal of the medical board. "You propose to charge Miss Tress on circumstantial evidence?" Lestrade asked, after a silence. He eyed Holmes keenly. "Not circumstantial, but cumulative, and as conclusive as you will find in this darkened city." Miss Vivian Tress, when summoned, arrived with an arrogance that bordered on hauteur. She was striking in appearance, tall, slender, with auburn hair plaited beneath a black hat, mouth unsmiling, arms elegantly folded within a severe coat. Her eyes flashed with angry wit as she regarded the assembled men. Holmes was precise but not cruel. "Miss Tress, would you account for a visit paid to your late uncle on the night in question, disguised as a widow, carrying a lipstick of Parisian make?" She fixed him with a glare that, I thought, would have unmanned a less self-assured adversary. For a moment, her composure held, but then Lestrade produced the glass, and Holmes the statements of her presence at the club and at Bedford Square. There was a silence, brittle as spun glass. Her pride began to crumble, and with a different womanly dignity, she spoke. "He owed me everything, and gave me nothing," she said quietly. That was her confession, not plea, but proclamation of injury. Lestrade recorded the words and gave the ritual phrase, "You'll have your day in court, miss." Her answer was a single, shuddering breath, a queen deposed. The city, which feeds ceaselessly upon stories of betrayal and scandal, embraced the tale of the veiled heiress, the secret will, and the killing that set the West End agog. I found Holmes, a week later, seated by the fire with the day's caper clutched in his long hands. The public, ever avid for sensation, had already fixed upon Vivian Tress the role of siren turned murderess, and upon Ferrier the mark of an unforgiving patriarch. Holmes, oddly pensive, allowed his pipe to smolder unpuffed. I sensed that for once, victory in detection had come at a cost to his cynical detachment. One cannot build a wall high enough against the consequences of secrecy, Watson. The wound festers unseen until it undoes those who trust too thoroughly in silence. I confess that I, too, felt an unfamiliar sorrow at the tragedy, with its roots not in a sudden quarrel, but in the slow grinding down of hope, pride wounded and never soothed. Mrs. Hudson, bustling in to set right the teacups, fixed Holmes with a look of maternal severity. "No more disguised widows up my staircase, if you please, Mr. Holmes," she said. "There's such a thing as decency, even for famous detectives." Holmes's smile, when it came, was oddly tender. He lifted his violin and, with a few searching notes, filled the room with an ache that I, however inarticulate, felt in my bones. I took up my pen anew, partly as an antidote to brooding, and in the hope that by chronicling this tale I might contribute, even in the smallest measure, to the understanding of human frailty and revenge. The city's fog drew its veil lower upon the rooftops, and outside the lamplighters plied their lonely circuit. But within our modest rooms, Holmes's melody wound itself between us, restless, mournful, achingly true to the world of shadows, in which even the greatest intellect is, at last, but a solitary watcher at the threshold of the human soul.